The first time I saw him, I thought someone had broken into my house. I was in the basement sorting through boxes I hadn't touched since my husband died. It was supposed to be a normal afternoon. Quiet, predictable. One of those days when you face the past in small, manageable pieces. I didn't hear the door. I didn't hear footsteps. Just movement. A shadow behind the shelves. My chest tightened. I stood still. There he was, crouched by the old water heater holding a wrench. His body language was calm, like he belonged there, but I knew I hadn't called anyone. I stepped back, pulse pounding. And then he looked up. No surprise. No apologies. He simply straightened, nodded politely, and gestured toward a printed paper tucked into a pipe clamp. Plumbing inspection, he said, scheduled through the main line. I didn't remember scheduling anything, but my daughter had access to the house calendar and a habit of managing my errands without telling me. So I nodded, not because I was certain, but because I didn't want to appear lost in my own home. He returned to his work. I returned to my boxes, or tried to. In truth, I couldn't focus. My eyes kept drifting to him. Younger, maybe 30. Clean shirt, steady hands, a calm, quiet way of moving that didn't demand anything. Just presence. And for some reason, that was more disarming than if he'd spoken. I hadn't been around that kind of presence in a long time. There was nothing flirtatious about it. No tension. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was aware of me. Not as a client, not as an older woman in his way. Just aware. It had been years since anyone noticed me without looking through me. Not as a memory, not as a role. Just me. And in that moment, standing in a dusty basement surrounded by the remains of someone else's life, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, like I still existed. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not about him. At least that's what I tried to tell myself. But about what I felt. That shift. That strange moment in the basement when something flickered inside me, then stayed. It wasn't the way he looked at me or what he said. It was what followed. The quiet jolt of being noticed after years of becoming invisible. I moved through my day as usual. I made tea, opened the windows, checked the weather. I glanced at the newspaper but couldn't focus on the words. Everything around me felt slightly altered, as if the world hadn't changed, but the way I saw it had. I told myself I was fine, that I'd imagined it, that nothing important had happened. But something had. And the more I tried to dismiss it, the more present it became. For years, I had lived in a kind of emotional quiet. Safe, polite, muted. I did what was expected. I spoke when spoken to. I smiled when it was appropriate. And I had convinced myself that was enough. Until yesterday. Until I realized how long it had been since I felt aware of my own presence. Of my own body. Not in the mirror, not through photos or memories, but in the moment. Just existing. Alive. Seen. It wasn't about the man. It wasn't about attraction. It was about recognition. About the simple, almost frightening feeling of still being here. That afternoon, I went back to the basement. I told myself it was to finish sorting the boxes, but that wasn't the truth. I wanted to see how it felt now. I wanted to sit in the same space and understand why that brief encounter had stirred something in me. I sat on the edge of an old trunk. The air smelled of dust and wood and old paper. I ran my fingers along the lid of a storage box and remembered how quiet this room had felt just a day ago. But today, the silence wasn't empty. It was alive with memory and tension and something new I couldn't name. I thought about how I'd tensed when he first appeared. How my body had frozen, alert, uncertain, and how, seconds later, I had softened. I hadn't noticed that part until now, the part where I let myself breathe again. That night, I didn't mention it to anyone. There was no one to tell, really. But I felt it in the way I moved. I brushed my hair more slowly. I added lotion to my hands. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. Because it felt good to care for a body I'd been ignoring. The next few days were quiet. But I wasn't. Not inside. I felt something building, something that hadn't stirred in years. I stood a little taller without realizing. I held eye contact longer at the store. I smiled at people I normally passed by. And one morning, I put on lipstick. Not for him. Not for anyone. For me. It reminded me of who I used to be. Of who I might still be. Later that week, I caught myself humming while folding laundry. Just a few notes, a melody I didn't even recognize. It made me stop. Not because it was strange, but because it felt like a signal. A quiet reminder that a part of me had never left. It had only been waiting. It happened faster than I expected and slower than I could explain. He came back the following week. This time, I heard the knock. Calm, measured. I opened the door without a second thought. There he stood. Same uniform, same quiet presence. He said it was a follow-up on the pressure valve. I nodded. Maybe it was true. Maybe it didn't matter. I let him in. We walked down to the basement again. He moved ahead, pausing briefly to make space for me. He didn't rush. Every step seemed deliberate. There was no awkwardness, just awareness. The kind that lingers just under the surface without ever needing to be named. He began to work, focused, silent. I stood nearby, pretending to sort through old shelves. My hands moved, but my mind wasn't there. I wasn't really cleaning. I was waiting. When he stood upright again, our eyes met. Not by accident. His expression didn't ask for anything. It didn't assume, but it didn't pull away either. He looked at me like I was something steady, and that alone made me feel less invisible. I stepped aside to let him pass. The space between us was narrow. Our shoulders brushed, lightly. Then his hand touched my arm. A gentle graze. It should have been nothing, but it stopped me. I turned only slightly, enough to catch the weight in his expression. And in that moment, something inside me leaned forward without moving. He didn't say a word, just took one small step closer, slowly, respectfully. He wasn't asking. He wasn't unsure. He was just there, inches away, eyes steady, waiting. Not for permission, but for presence. I didn't flinch. I didn't turn away. I let it happen. His lips met mine. Soft, slow, real. It wasn't intense. It wasn't rushed. It was careful, measured. A moment shared between two people standing in a room filled with the remnants of an old life. I didn't close my eyes. I stayed there, awake, feeling every second. When we pulled back, no one spoke. There was no need. Nothing felt out of place. There was no guilt, no apology in the air. Just something new stretching between us like a thread that hadn't existed moments before. He nodded. Just once. Not for approval, for understanding. Then he left. I didn't follow. I didn't watch from the window. I stayed in the basement. I needed to. I leaned against a wooden beam and let the stillness wrap around me. I wasn't trembling. I wasn't confused. I was aware. Fully. Deeply. Present. It wasn't about the kiss. It was about what it returned to me. A sense that I still existed outside the labels I'd worn for so long. That I was allowed to feel something that had nothing to do with grief or memory or obligation. That night, I didn't try to interpret it. I didn't dissect the meaning. I didn't wonder what it meant for tomorrow. I just allowed it to be part of my day. And for the first time in years, I didn't fall asleep inside silence. I fell asleep inside clarity. I didn't try to explain it, even to myself. There was no need. The kiss had happened. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a secret. It was something honest. Something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. The next morning, everything felt slightly sharper. I noticed the way the light touched the floor, the way the kettle sounded when it began to boil. I caught my own reflection in the hallway mirror and paused, not to fix anything, just to look, just to see who was still there. I didn't dress differently to impress anyone, but I reached for a shirt I hadn't worn in years. Soft, loose, once a favorite. I put on small earrings I used to save for dinners out. Not because I was going anywhere, but because something in me had come back, and I wanted to meet her halfway. It wasn't about him. Not really. It was about the way I felt in my own body after that moment. The weight I no longer carried. The permission I no longer waited for. Nothing dramatic happened that day. I made tea. I opened the windows. I hummed a little while folding towels. But every small act felt more real, more mine. Not something I was doing out of routine. Something I was choosing. The house, too, began to shift. I moved a chair into better light. Took down a heavy painting that had never meant much. Replaced a dusty vase with a glass jar of fresh stems from the yard. I wasn't redecorating. I was reclaiming. He didn't call, and I didn't wait. I didn't check the time. I didn't replay anything. The kiss wasn't a beginning or an end. It was a door I had opened and walked through. I didn't walk through it to follow him. I walked through it to find myself. That afternoon, I stepped outside and sat on the back steps. No book, no phone, just air, just warmth, just space. I listened to the wind move through the trees, the faint hum of a neighbor's lawnmower, the clink of a wind chime I'd stopped noticing years ago. And I realized how long it had been since I'd allowed silence to hold me without rushing to fill it. For years, I had been careful with my emotions, careful with my words, careful not to be too much, too sad, too hopeful, too loud. But now there was no one to shrink for, no one to adjust to, no one to explain myself to. And I didn't feel alone. I felt clear. It wasn't clarity like a solution. It was clarity like sunlight on water. Shifting, moving, but honest, unfiltered. That night, I fell asleep without wondering what he thought. Without rehearsing answers for questions he hadn't asked. I didn't imagine what would happen if he came back. And I didn't fear what it meant if he didn't. Because the point wasn't him coming back. The point was that I had returned to myself. I didn't think about seeing him again. Until I did. And when the thought returned, it wasn't with longing. It came with purpose. That morning, while pouring coffee, I caught myself standing differently. Straight. Lighter. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was deciding. I found his number in an old thread my daughter had sent me when the kitchen faucet leaked. I opened the message, stared at it, then closed it. I didn't text. Not yet. But the idea stayed. Quiet and steady. The house felt different. Not because anything changed, because I had. I moved through it like I belonged again. Like I wasn't just passing time, I was living. That afternoon, I made a list. Candles, fresh bread, a bottle of dry white wine. I didn't call it preparation. I called it intention. For space. For stillness. For whatever was coming. I didn't expect him to return. But if he did, if I chose to open that door, I wanted the space to reflect how far I'd come. Nothing dramatic, just deliberate. By evening, I still hadn't messaged, but I knew I would. It wasn't about him. It was about how I felt when I allowed myself to want something without apology. Later that night, I wrote one line in my journal. I am allowed to move forward without asking who approves. Then I texted him. Simple. Clear. A follow-up if you're nearby this week. His reply came 2 hours later. Tomorrow at 8, if that works. It worked. I didn't plan an outfit. I didn't script a conversation. I just created space. 1 candle, 2 glasses. No expectations. At 7:58, I stood in the hallway. Calm. Not for him. For me. When the doorbell rang, I didn't hesitate. I opened it. This time, I didn't feel like a homeowner welcoming help. I felt like a woman who had invited clarity into her life. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened. That was enough. He stepped inside slowly, noticing everything: the candle, the bread, the light. He didn't comment. I didn't offer an explanation. I led him to the living room. He followed without question. We sat, side by side, not across. I poured wine. He accepted. No performance, no flirtation, just presence. We sipped. We breathed. No words for a while. Then I asked softly if the pressure valve was working now. He smiled. Perfectly. We both knew I wasn't asking about plumbing. Silence again. But this silence held something steady. When he stood to leave, I didn't stop him. I didn't need to. He paused at the hallway mirror. I stayed behind, just far enough. He looked at me through the reflection. I looked back, longer than I meant to. And he noticed. Then he left, quietly, without a word. I remained where I was, not waiting, not wishing, just whole. He came back the next evening, right on time. No delay, no hesitation. I opened the door before he could knock twice. This time, he brought nothing but himself. No tools, no clipboard. And I didn't ask. We both knew this wasn't about repairs anymore. He stepped in. The space welcomed him, not because of what I'd done to the house, but because of how I stood in it. I wasn't hosting. I was simply present. The quiet between us wasn't awkward. It was grounded. He followed me into the kitchen. I offered tea, not wine. No performance. Just familiarity. We stood near the counter. Not close, not distant. The kind of nearness that makes room for breath. When I reached for a glass, our fingers brushed. Once. Then again when he passed a napkin. Then again reaching for a plate. After the third time, I didn't move away. He didn't step forward. We just stood there, the quiet becoming something steady. Then I turned toward him. Slightly. Just enough to meet his gaze. And there it was again. Not a question, not pressure. Just a calm, steady presence. The kind that doesn't ask for permission. It waits for truth. So I stepped in. Not boldly, not carefully. Just enough to say, I'm here. And he met me there. The kiss was slow, real, not an echo of the first. This one didn't surprise me. It confirmed something. I didn't close my eyes. I wanted to remember what it felt like to be sure. We didn't speak after. We sat for a while, shared food, shared time. No drama, no declarations. When he left, I didn't wait at the door. I turned back to the kitchen and poured myself another cup of tea. There was no guilt. No need to rewind the moment in my mind. There was only stillness. Like I had chosen something. Fully. Without fear. Later that night, I stood in the hallway and looked at my reflection in the mirror. Not searching, just seeing. The woman looking back wasn't someone new. She was someone I'd missed. I thought of all the times I had made myself smaller. Quieter, easier to manage. I thought of how long I'd been waiting for a reason to stop doing that. Tonight I hadn't asked. I hadn't explained. I hadn't held my breath. I had stayed where I was and let myself be met. That felt more intimate than anything else. When I lay down, I didn't plan what to say next. I didn't wonder what it meant. I just rested. Because I wasn't waiting anymore. I didn't wait for him to text. I didn't plan anything extravagant either. But something had settled in me, something calm and certain. That morning, I stood at the kitchen sink with the window open. The air was warm. I made tea slowly, deliberately. The rhythm of the day belonged to me. At noon, I sent the message. 3 words, no flourish. Come by tonight. There was no need for more. I didn't spend the afternoon preparing. I didn't overthink. I moved through the house like I owned it again. Not as a space to maintain, as a space to inhabit. I opened the curtains. moved a chair near the window to catch the evening light, wiped the table, lit one candle, not for romance, but for softness, a quiet presence in the room. By 7:50, the house felt complete. Not because it was perfect, because it was mine. When the doorbell rang at 8, I answered without hesitation. He stepped inside. No greeting, none needed. He noticed. Something in his posture shifted. He sensed it. This was different. I didn't fill the space. I let him adjust. I led him to the living room. I sat. I didn't invite. I waited. After a pause, he joined me. Not across, not too close. Beside. No small talk, no pretense. Just breath and presence and quiet awareness. I turned toward him. Slowly. He looked unsure. For the first time. I reached for his hand. Simple. Steady. There was a question in his eyes. Not doubt. Recognition. I leaned in. Not testing. Not teasing. Calm. Whole. I had nothing to prove. This time I kissed him, and he let go. Not of control, but of the question, the pause, the wondering. Now he knew the kiss was grounded, present. We didn't rush, we didn't retreat. When we paused, we stayed close, foreheads touching, breathing in the same quiet. Nothing more needed to happen. We sat for a while. The candle flickered, shadows slow and steady. No music, no words, just presence. I leaned back slightly, hand still in his. His shoulders eased, like something unspoken had finally landed. This wasn't a story to explain. This wasn't about being wanted. This was about being here. Eventually, we moved to the kitchen. I poured water. He dried the cups. Still no conversation. But something passed between us. Unwritten, solid. When he stood at the door, I didn't speak. I stepped forward and placed my hand lightly on his chest. A gesture that said, I'm not hiding. He nodded. Not to grant something, to acknowledge it. Then he left. After he left, I didn't feel the need to analyze the moment. I didn't replay each look or touch. I didn't search for meaning beyond what had already been clear in the silence between us. Instead, I stood in the kitchen, letting the air cool against my skin. The candle still flickered in the corner, giving off a soft amber glow. The house was quiet again, but the silence no longer felt like absence. It felt like ownership, like presence. I washed the 2 glasses slowly, one by one, watching the water swirl through them. There was nothing performative about what happened tonight. No milestones, no promises. But still, something had shifted. I thought of how often I used to interpret silence as rejection. How easily I had assumed that if someone didn't say something, it meant they didn't feel it. But now I understood that sometimes silence is the fullest kind of expression. I didn't know when I'd see him again. I didn't plan to ask. That wasn't the point anymore. The point was that when I had something to give, I gave it. And when I needed space, I took it. Without shrinking. Without apology. Later, I stood by the window and looked out at the street. Empty sidewalks. One porch light flickering down the block. The stillness of the evening felt familiar now. But this time, it didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. I breathed in deeply, then let it out slowly. And as I turned off the light and made my way down the hall, I wasn't carrying anything heavy with me. I had already let go. The next morning, I didn't wonder if he'd call. I didn't pace or check my phone. I watered the plants, wiped the kitchen counters, opened every window in the house. The light felt honest, and so did I. I wasn't rehearsing anything anymore. I wasn't waiting for clarity. I had it. By noon, I'd changed the sheets, rearranged the pillows, and gone for a short walk. Not to clear my mind, but because my body asked for air. Everything I did was quiet, not empty, intentional. That afternoon, I sat in the living room without turning on music. I didn't need a soundtrack. I watched how the sun moved across the floor, how the dust floated when no one stirred it. I existed in stillness without the need to fill it. Around 4, a soft knock at the door. I opened it, already knowing it would be him. We didn't greet each other. No hug, no smile, just a nod, a quiet acknowledgement. He stepped inside. The light followed him. There were no expectations, no pressure. I didn't feel nervous. There was no pretending, no inner voice questioning what came next. We walked through the hallway, slow, steady. I led him to the same room, the same couch, but the moment was different. Not heavier, not more serious, just quieter. We sat. This time, closer than before. Naturally, without calculation. Our hands didn't find each other immediately. They didn't need to. We let the silence arrive before us and settle into the space. I looked at him once. His eyes were steady, kind. He didn't reach for me. He didn't need to. He was here. That was enough. I leaned my head against the back of the couch. Exhaled. For a while, that's all we did. Shared air, shared time. We didn't talk. We didn't explain. We didn't define it. We just stayed. There was no tension. No need to impress or impress upon. There was only presence. I didn't wonder what he thought. I didn't try to interpret his silence. It didn't carry weight. It carried peace. He eventually reached down, brushing his fingers against the side of my hand. The touch was gentle, a question wrapped in patience. I turned my palm upward. That was all the answer needed. Our hands rested together, unmoving. Not holding, just touching. A soft place where connection lived without expectation. We stayed like that as the light changed. Shadows lengthened. The candle from the night before still sat on the table, unlit, but not forgotten. It had done its work. He shifted slightly. I didn't. My stillness was my choice. My comfort was not dependent on his next move. And yet, there was comfort in him being near. It occurred to me in that silence that nothing about this had been accidental. Not his arrival, not my openness, not the slow undoing of the distance I'd built around myself. He wasn't filling a space in me. He was sitting beside it. And that changed everything. Later, when he stood to go, I didn't follow him to the door. I didn't make promises. I didn't hint at tomorrow. I simply let him go. Not because I was afraid to keep him, but because I finally understood I didn't need to hold on to everything that felt good to believe it was real. Some things, when they're real, don't need to be chased. They stay, even after they leave. When the door closed, I didn't feel the drop of absence. I felt the shape of presence that still lingered in the room. I returned to the couch, sat in the same place, and let the quiet remain. And for the first time in my life, I didn't wonder what it meant. I simply let it mean what it was. Enough. It started with a mirror. The same one in the hallway I had passed for years without really looking. This morning I stopped. Not because I saw something different in the reflection, but because, for the first time, I didn't look away. I stood there, still, watching the woman in the glass. No makeup, no plan, no smile for anyone else's comfort. She looked back at me without needing to be fixed. I used to think transformation was loud, a leap, a moment that changed everything. But mine came slowly, in pauses. In quiet invitations I said yes to. In doors I opened without knowing what was on the other side. The man I kissed didn't create this change. He witnessed it. And maybe that was the point. For once, I didn't need to be shaped by someone else's story. I had written my own, without noise or permission. After I stepped away from the mirror, I didn't feel different. I felt known. Not by him, but myself. That afternoon, I sat outside. The air was warm. My hands rested on my lap. I wasn't waiting. I wasn't searching. I wasn't filling space. I was living in it. There's a kind of power in no longer needing to be seen to feel real, in waking up and knowing you've already arrived, that whatever happens next is just the continuation, not the beginning. He may come again, or he may not. But the version of me that opened the door to him, she's still here. And she's not going anywhere. Not for anyone. Not even for him. I used to count significance by what changed externally. New jobs, people, moments that made noise. But real significance is subtle. It moves through you without needing to announce itself. It lives in the way you speak to yourself when no one's around, in the way you decide what stays and what no longer belongs. This time, I chose stillness over spectacle. No final messages, no quiet longing, just breath and space. And in that space, I remembered who I was before I learned to please. Before I apologized for needing, for feeling, for taking up room. I remembered the girl who used to laugh alone in bookstores, who rearranged furniture just because it felt better, who wore bright colors without wondering who might be looking. She wasn't gone. She was waiting. And in these soft, quiet days, she returned. Sometimes the most radical thing a woman can do is stop performing her own absence. I no longer felt the need to narrate everything, to explain what this was, or what it wasn't. I didn't need to ask, where is this going? I was already there. I made dinner that night with both windows open. I danced in the kitchen while water boiled. I hummed a melody I didn't recognize. And I didn't feel watched. I felt free. Later, I wrote in my journal again. Not to process, just to record. Not how I felt about him, but how I felt in me. And what I wrote was simple. I have nothing to prove. Not to anyone. Not anymore. I closed the notebook and placed it gently on the shelf. Then I sat in the evening light, let it fall across my face, and did nothing. And that, finally, was everything.